Shalom. This week we enter the book of Leviticus, or Vayikra. We'll be looking at Leviticus 1:1 through 5:26. Leviticus is not a book that's preached about by many pastors or spoken of by many from the pulpit, because the book of Leviticus is not that exciting. The book of Vayikra is filled with laws. The laws for the priests, the laws for the people, the sacrifices that they were to bring to Elohim. The book of Leviticus is not a favorite among biblical readers. Hollywood hasn't created any scenes from Leviticus like it has Genesis and Exodus, because Genesis has creation and the entire story of how man and woman came into place, and Exodus has the release from Egypt. But Leviticus is questionable in certain ways. Leviticus is full of sacrifices. Leviticus has a lot to tell us if we look at the ancient ritual as relevant lessons. In Eastern cultures of that time, sacrifices on altars were brought to feed gods and were represented by statues of deities. People brought the gods animals, grains, oil, among other gifts. In contrast, we learn in Torah that animal and grain sacrifices were brought by Israelites to create a link between the one Elohim and the people. The priests sacrificed for the people, and for this they were compensated. But it was the presentation of the sacrifices by the Israelites themselves to the priest that was the most precious gift, because their personal sacrifices drew them near and closer to Elohim. The Hebrew word used for sacrifice is korban, which means to draw near or to draw close. Unlike the English translation, which suggests losing something or an act of offering, the korban enabled the Israelites to draw near to Elohim's justice and mercy. In ancient times, the Israelites were commanded to bring sacrifices, bring the best of their flock and herds, without blemish, for animal sacrifices. Their offerings, specifically prescribed, represented thanksgiving, forgiveness, atonement for sin, free will offerings, and more. Perfect atonement, for example, was granted through a perfect offering. But this unraveled when the Israelites chose not to honor God through sacrifice. They chose not to keep his commandments accordingly, and therefore committed sin. Let's begin by reading Vayikra. Leviticus 1:1 states, Elohim called to Moshe and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any of you bring an offering to Elohim, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to offer a male without defect. He must present it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, so that it will be acceptable to Elohim." The tent of meeting was a small structure inside the large tabernacle. The tent of meeting contained the sanctuary in one part and the most holy place with the ark and the testimony in the other part. These two sections were separated by a curtain. Elohim revealed himself to Moshe in the most holy place. This offering, a voluntary offering, was the offering for sin committed inadvertently by the people, presented to Elohim in a special way. Leviticus 2 states, when someone brings a grain offering to Elohim, his offering is to be of fine flour. He is to pour it out, put incense on it, and take it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest shall take a handful of the fine flour and oil, together with all the incense, and burn it as memorial portion on the altar, an offering made by fire, and aroma pleasing to Elohim. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is the most holy part of the offering, made to Elohim by fire. Chapter 3 of Leviticus states, if someone's offering is a fellowship offering, and he offers an animal from the herd, whether male or female, he is to present before Elohim an animal without defect. He is to lay his hands on the head of the offering and slaughter it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Chapter 4 reads in verse 1, Elohim said to Moshe, say to the Israelites, when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any way of Elohim's commands, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, he must bring Elohim a young bull without defect as a sin offering for the sins he has committed. And chapter 5 reads, if a person sins because he does not speak up when he hears a public charge to testify regarding something he has seen or learned about, he will be held responsible. Or if a person touches anything ceremonially unclean, whether a carcass of unclean wild animals, or of unclean livestock, or of unclean creature that is among the ground, even though he is unaware of it, he has become unclean and is guilty. These various offerings were to be given by the children of Israel. They were to be given to Elohim. They were to be given to him as free will, as an offering, as a sacrifice, as a gift. But all had a special purpose. The burnt offering spoken of in Leviticus 1 was voluntary, to make payment for the sins in general. It showed a person's devotion to Elohim. The grain offering in Leviticus 2 was also voluntary, to show honor and respect to Elohim in worship. It was acknowledgement that all we have belongs to Elohim. The fellowship offering in Leviticus 3 was also voluntary. It was to express gratitude to Elohim, to symbolize peace and fellowship with Elohim. The sin offering was required. It was to make payment for unintentional sin or uncleanliness, neglect or thoughtlessness. It restored the sinner to fellowship with Elohim and showed seriousness of the sin. And the guilt offering in Leviticus 5 was required. It was to make payment for sins against Elohim and others. A sacrifice was made to Elohim, and the injured person was repaired and compensated. This provided compensation for the injuries of each party. All of these sin offerings have been done away with. They've been done away with due to the death of Christ. They've been done away with due to the death of Yeshua on the cross. We no longer have to bring an animal. We no longer have to sacrifice an animal, because now the greatest sacrifice was made for us, the death of Yeshua on the cross. Yeshua gave his life intentionally for us. But what does that mean? That means we are forgiven of our sin once we take our sin to the cross. That means we are forgiven of our sin once we give ourselves to Elohim as sacrifice. Elohim's Son, Yeshua, committed the ultimate sacrifice, death on a wooden cross, death for your sin, death for what you do wrong. But that doesn't mean you can just go around doing wrong. That means you have to take it seriously. That means you have to look at it from a different perspective. You are no longer required to bring an animal as an offering, as a sacrifice. You are required to sacrifice yourself daily and give yourself to perfection and give yourself to Elohim and give yourself to his ways, his wisdom, and his will.